The third time that woman drove through my ranch fence, she crushed the little yellow flowers my wife had planted the week after her second round of chemo. And I remember standing there at my kitchen window with a coffee mug in my hand, thinking, all right, that's enough, because some people push and push and push until they finally run into the one person who doesn't move. Her black Cadillac Escalade came tearing across my gravel road like she owned the place, dust flying everywhere, cattle scattering toward the creek, and my wife Evelyn just sat frozen on the porch with her oxygen tube in her nose, watching her butterfly garden disappear under 3,500 pounds of suburban entitlement. The crazy part is, she never even slowed down, not a wait, not an apology, nothing, just tires chewing through bluebonnets, while her little HOA sticker flashed on the back window like some kind of badge. That was the morning I decided Diane Mercer was either gonna learn respect or learn consequences. My name's Wade Holloway. I'm 59 years old, retired Navy mechanic, spent almost 3 decades working hydraulic systems on carriers out in the Pacific. And these days I raise cattle out in eastern Oklahoma, about 15 minutes outside a little town called Bell Creek. My wife Evelyn and I bought this ranch 6 years ago right after her cancer diagnosis, because the doctors kept saying stress was killing her faster than the disease was. So we sold our place in Tulsa, bought 200 acres of rolling pasture land with a creek and an old cedar barn, and Evelyn turned the front half-acre into this wild butterfly sanctuary full of milkweed honeysuckle, black-eyed Susans. All these flowers meant to attract monarch butterflies during migration season. She'd sit on the porch wrapped in a blanket with her tea beside her oxygen tank and just watch them for hours like they carried some kind of peace with them. Then Meadow Ridge Estates showed up. 200 identical luxury homes built right along the south edge of my property. Beige stucco walls, fake stone mailboxes, golf carts everywhere, and an HOA so strict they'd fine people for leaving garbage cans visible after sunset. And leading all of it was Diane Mercer, 54 years old, former pharmaceutical sales rep, professionally highlighted blonde hair, smile sharp enough to cut steel, the kind of woman who says, "Bless your heart," like it's a threat. The first time I met her, she was standing beside my gate in high heels, with a clipboard measuring my fence posts while talking on Bluetooth headphones. I remember looking at her thinking, there's no way this woman belongs anywhere near livestock. I walked over and said, "Ma'am, can I help you with something?" She didn't even look up. "I'm assessing access routes for the neighborhood utilities." I said, "Well, this is private property." That's when she finally looked at me, real slow, like I was the inconvenience. "There's an established access path through here." "No, ma'am, there isn't." She smiled then. Not a friendly smile either. The kind people use when they already think they've won. "Honey, we've been using this road since before you moved here." Now maybe some folks would have backed down hearing that, but after 28 years in the military, after seeing what real conflict looks like, you develop a nose for people who use confidence to hide lies. Diane wasn't calm because she was right. She was calm because nobody had challenged her before. I told her there was a county access road less than half a mile east that connected directly to their water station, and she actually laughed at me. "That road adds 12 minutes to our maintenance schedule." I remember saying, "Well, I guess your maintenance guys better leave earlier then." That wiped the smile off her face fast. She climbed into her Escalade, slammed the door, and tore off across my pasture, so hard she left tire grooves through Evelyn's gravel walking path. Diesel smell hung in the air long after she disappeared. That night Evelyn asked me who she was, and I tried brushing it off because my wife already had enough on her plate. But a few days later Diane came back. Then again the next morning. Then every single morning after that, around 7:15 like clockwork. Straight through my gate, straight past my house, straight through Evelyn's sanctuary. At first she claimed she was checking utility lines. Then it became HOA inspection routes. Then suddenly, half the neighborhood started following her around in golf carts, treating my ranch like some kind of attraction. And here's the thing people don't understand about men like me. I'm not quick-tempered. I don't yell much. Navy taught me patience. But there's a point where protecting peace requires confrontation. And every day I watched Evelyn shrink a little smaller, every time she heard that SUV coming up the road. One evening she looked out the window at her crushed flowers and quietly said, "I feel like we're being watched all the time." That sentence hit me harder than anything Diane had done up to that point. Because this ranch wasn't just land. It was the place my wife came to heal. And somebody had decided her peace didn't matter. After Evelyn said that, after she admitted, she didn't even feel comfortable sitting on her own porch anymore, something shifted inside me. Not anger exactly, not yet anyway. More like that cold mechanical focus you get right before a storm hits. I'd seen it happen on carriers before deployment. Everybody moving a little quieter, checking bolts twice, waiting for impact. Diane Mercer thought she was bullying an old rancher. What she didn't realize was she'd turned herself into a problem. And solving problems was the only thing the Navy ever really trained me to do. The next Tuesday morning, I woke up to the sound of engines outside my house. Not one engine, several. I looked out the kitchen window and nearly dropped my coffee mug. 5 SUVs parked along my driveway, golf carts lined up behind them, people wandering around my pasture carrying bottled water and phones like they were on some kind of winery tour. Diane stood in the middle of Evelyn's butterfly garden, wearing white designer boots and sunglasses, waving a clipboard around while talking to a crowd of HOA residents. "This section here would make a beautiful community recreation space," she said. Community recreation space. I remember Evelyn hearing that from the porch and just slowly lowering her eyes toward the flowers. That hurt worse than any shouting could have. I walked outside and said, "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Diane turned around smiling like we were old friends. "Oh good, you're awake. We're doing a neighborhood assessment. You're trespassing." "No, Wade. We're evaluating shared environmental resources." To this day, I still don't know how people like her say ridiculous things with such confidence. One guy standing beside her khaki shorts, tucked-in polo shirt, expensive watch, actually asked me if the creek on my property could support paddle boats for HOA family events. I stared at him for about 3 seconds before saying, "Sir, that creek barely supports catfish." A few people laughed. Diane didn't. She stepped closer to me, lowering her voice. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. And you're standing in my wife's flowers." Her smile disappeared instantly. For a second I saw the real Diane under all the polished suburban nonsense. Cold, irritated, mean. People like her hate boundaries, because boundaries remind them they're not in control. That was the day I started documenting everything. I drove into town and bought 6 trail cameras, the kind hunters use during deer season. Motion activated, infrared capable, weatherproof. By sunset I had every entrance to my property covered. Fence posts, oak trees, barn corners, overlapping sight lines, no blind spots. Navy training sticks with you. You learn real quick that evidence matters more than emotion. 3 days later, I sat at my kitchen table, reviewing footage when I realized something weird. Diane wasn't just bringing people onto my property. She was charging them. I watched her collect cash from a couple standing beside their golf cart, while she pointed toward my cattle pasture like she was some kind of safari guide. $50 a head for authentic ranch tour. She'd even advertised them online through the HOA community page. I remember leaning back in my chair laughing for about 10 straight seconds, because suddenly everything made sense. This wasn't about utility access anymore. Diane had turned my ranch into her own private attraction. When I showed Evelyn the footage, she just blinked at the screen and quietly said, "Who does that?" The sad part is, I think people like Diane stop seeing others as human after a while. Everybody becomes an obstacle, a customer, or a prop in whatever fantasy they've built around themselves. Over the next few weeks, things escalated fast. HOA tour became regular events. Residents wandered through my property taking selfies beside my cattle, leaving gates open, throwing food near the creek. One afternoon, my best bull, Rusty, got spooked by a drone somebody was flying over the pasture and crashed through a barbed wire section hard enough to tear his rear leg open. Cost me nearly $1,000 in vet bills and 3 sleepless nights trying to keep infection out. Meanwhile, Evelyn stopped going outside completely. That's the part I still struggle talking about honestly, because cancer already steals enough from a person. It steals their strength, their appetite, their sleep, their confidence. Watching somebody also lose their peace at the same time feels cruel in a way I can't really explain unless you've lived it. One night around 2 in the morning, I found her sitting alone in the dark living room looking out the front window. She said, "Do you think they'll ever stop?" I told her yes, before I even knew if it was true. And that's when I made the mistake Diane probably regrets more than anything else. I started digging. Turns out Meadow Ridge Estates had a whole pile of strange paperwork attached to it. County easements, utility agreements, land access claims going back almost 20 years. Most folks would have looked at those documents and gotten overwhelmed. Me, I spent 28 years reading technical manuals the size of phone books. Patience doesn't scare me. I spent 4 straight days at the county records office, buried in old property maps and filing cabinets while a clerk named Marlene kept bringing me stale coffee and gossip. Somewhere around hour 10, she leaned over and said, "You know Diane's been fighting with ranch owners around here for years, right?" That caught my attention. Turns out I wasn't the first target. An older rancher named Curtis Bell sold his land cheap after endless HOA complaints about livestock smell. Another family got buried in legal threats over fencing disputes. Diane had been squeezing rural landowners for years, trying to expand Meadow Ridge outward piece by piece. But then I found something bigger. The utility easement Diane kept claiming gave her legal access through my ranch. Expired in 1991. Not disputed, not blurry, not complicated. Expired. I must have reread that document 15 times because it felt too easy. But there it was in plain English, stamped by the county itself. The access agreement ended decades ago and was never renewed, meaning every single trip through my property had been illegal. Every tour, every inspection, every threat, every demand. I remember sitting there in that dusty records room staring at the paper, while this strange calm settled over me, because suddenly Diane Mercer didn't look powerful anymore. She looked sloppy, and sloppy people panic when they realize somebody finally noticed the truth. That evening, I called an old Navy friend of mine named Frank Delaney, who'd become a property attorney down in Dallas. I emailed him copies of everything, and about an hour later he called me back laughing so hard he could barely breathe. "Wade, this woman's been bluffing for years. So what happens now?" "What happens now," he said, "depends entirely on how hard you want to hit back." I wish I could say I immediately chose the high road. Truth is, I sat on my porch for a long time thinking about that question, while Evelyn slept inside with her oxygen machine humming softly through the wall. Because there's a difference between defending your home and going to war over it. The problem was Diane Mercer had already decided we were at war, and she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. 3 days after Frank confirmed Diane's easement claim was worthless. I got a certified letter taped to my mailbox from some law office in Oklahoma City threatening me with lawsuits, county penalties, obstruction charges, the whole dramatic package. According to Diane Mercer, my ranch was now considered a disruption to community infrastructure efficiency. I remember standing there at my kitchen counter reading that sentence twice before laughing out loud, because only an HOA president could describe cattle and butterflies like they were acts of domestic terrorism. But underneath all the legal nonsense was the real message. She was scared. People who think they own everything don't threaten lawsuits unless they feel control slipping away. That same afternoon, I drove into Tulsa and met Frank for lunch. He reviewed the letter, took one sip of iced tea, and slid it right back across the table. "She's bluffing." I figured. No, Wade. I mean, she's really bluffing. This attorney has no idea her easement expired. Diane probably fed him fake paperwork. That got my attention fast. Fake paperwork. Frank leaned closer, lowering his voice. If she forged county access documents, this moves past civil harassment. That becomes fraud. Now here's the thing about people like Diane. They can usually talk their way through small lies. But the bigger the lie gets, the more cracks start showing. And once cracks appear, everybody around them starts getting nervous, including their own family. 2 nights later, around midnight, my trail camera alerted my phone. I rolled over in bed, checked the footage, and there was Diane's husband standing beside my gate with a flashlight and measuring tape. Quiet little guy named Grant Mercer, accountant type, always looked exhausted whenever I'd seen him during those HOA tour. He spent 20 minutes examining my entrance posts before finally driving away. Next morning, my phone rang from an unknown number. "Mr. Holloway, this is Grant Mercer. We need to talk." We met at a diner off Highway 62, where truckers stop for pie and burnt coffee. Grant looked terrible, pale face, wrinkled shirt, hands shaking, while he stirred cream into his coffee over and over again, without drinking it. Finally, he slid a manila envelope across the table. "You were right about the easement." Inside were copies of county records, expired permits, and forged renewal documents with fake signatures attached to them. I looked up at him slowly. "Does Diane know you're here?" "She filed for emergency HOA powers yesterday," he muttered. "She thinks if she pressures the county hard enough they'll side with her before anybody notices the paperwork. And the signatures." Grant rubbed both hands down his face. "She had them recreated years ago." I just sat there staring at him because part of me honestly couldn't believe somebody would go that far over suburban politics and property access. But another part of me absolutely could. Power changes people, especially small power. Give somebody control over mailbox colors, and suddenly they think they're emperor of North America. "What do you want from me?" I finally asked. Grant looked me dead in the eyes. "Stop her." And that's exactly what I decided to do. The following week, I installed hydraulic steel bollards at my ranch entrance. 6-inch reinforced steel cylinders buried deep in concrete with pressure sensors under the gravel road. The same kind of barrier systems government facilities use to stop unauthorized vehicles. Navy mechanics understand hydraulics better than most people understand their own marriages. And once I started sketching designs, the whole thing came together beautifully. From the road, the setup looked harmless. Just another ranch entrance. But if a vehicle crossed those sensors above 5 miles per hour, those steel posts would rise out of the ground faster than a coffin lid in a horror movie. I posted warning signs everywhere. Private property. Authorized access only. Security measures active. Then I waited. And sure enough, Diane Mercer took the bait. She went completely nuclear online. Facebook live streams accusing me of holding the community hostage. HOA meetings about rural extremism. At one point, she actually claimed my gate barriers were a threat to democracy. Democracy. Lady, it's a cattle ranch. But the craziest part. Half the neighborhood believed her. The other half started asking questions. Questions like why nobody had seen these easement documents before. Questions about missing HOA money. Questions about why Diane suddenly seemed panicked all the time. Then came the final announcement. Diane declared Meadow Ridge would conduct a community access demonstration the following Monday morning. 15 vehicles driving through my ranch together to prove she still controlled the easement. Frank called me after seeing the live stream. Please tell me your cameras are recording. Though, they're recording. Monday morning arrived cool and windy, one of those gray Oklahoma mornings where everything feels tense before a thunderstorm. Evelyn insisted on sitting outside beside me despite being weak from chemo. She wrapped herself in a blanket while monarch butterflies drifted through the garden behind her and quietly said, "You know she's not gonna stop." "No," I answered, watching dust rise in the distance. "But she only has to be wrong once." At exactly 10:14 a.m., the convoy appeared over the hill. SUVs, pickup trucks, golf carts, and right in front leading the parade like some suburban war general. Diane Mercer in her black Escalade, wearing oversized sunglasses. Even from 50 yards away, I could see that smug little smile on her face. She slowed near the gate, just enough to yell out the window, "You really thought you could scare me?" I stood there calmly with my coffee mug in hand. "No ma'am," I said. "I thought I could stop you." Then she hit the gas. What happened next lasted maybe 2 seconds. The Escalade crossed the pressure sensors. Hydraulic locks engaged, and 2 solid steel bollards exploded upward straight into the undercarriage of her SUV, with a sound like a shotgun blast inside a church. Bang! The front end lifted violently. Steam burst from the engine compartment. Transmission fluid poured across the gravel. And Diane Mercer's Escalade came to a dead stop, hanging halfway off the ground, while her horn locked on screaming across the pasture. The convoy behind her froze instantly. People started backing up. One golf cart drove straight into a ditch. And then the sheriff's department rolled in, along with county investigators, along with 2 very interested state fraud officers Frank had quietly contacted 3 days earlier. I'll never forget Diane climbing out of that destroyed SUV shrieking about lawsuits, while one investigator calmly held up the forged easement paperwork in front of her face asking, "Ma'am, would you like to explain these signatures?" Watching the color drain out of her face was honestly surreal, because right there in that moment, she finally realized the game was over. Not because of the bollards, not because of the cameras, but because somebody finally stopped being afraid of her. 6 months later, Diane Mercer accepted a plea deal for fraud and falsifying county documents. Meadow Ridge Estates had to renegotiate every utility agreement legally. Several homeowners sued the HOA board, and Grant divorced her before sentencing. As for Evelyn, her doctors eventually said reducing stress probably saved her life, as much as the treatments did. These days she's back on the porch most evenings watching monarch butterflies drift across the pasture like little pieces of sunlight. And every now and then somebody online tells me I overreacted. Maybe I did. But I'll tell you this much. If somebody kept driving through the one peaceful place your dying wife had left in this world, what exactly would you have done different? Let me know down in the comments, because honestly, I still think about that question sometimes. And if you've ever dealt with HOA insanity, power-hungry neighbors, or people who thought kindness meant weakness, hit subscribe. Because trust me, Stories like this happen way more often than folks realize.